June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. Unoffizier Burkhardt sat quietly with a pencil in hand, his diary hidden from sight. His writing shook slightly with each word. If his officers ever discovered what he was recording, the punishment would have been solitary confinement. "The Americans must be lying to us," he wrote. "No country could have this much while fighting on two fronts." Moments earlier, from the window of his train, Burkhardt had seen something that defied 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights shone brightly from every farmhouse, every street corner, and every shop window. Across the Texas plains, a glowing network of electricity stretched endlessly, even at 10 at night. Back in Germany, blackout orders had left entire cities in darkness since 1940. Before the war, only about 20% of German farms even had electricity. Yet here, in the very nation their propaganda had called weak and broken, electricity was as common as water. On that same day, 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped off the train. They weren't packed into cattle cars or shoved into freight wagons. Instead, they arrived in cushioned Pullman passenger coaches, complete with dining services and sleeping berths. The entire town of Mexia had gathered to watch. None of them realized that this arrival would mark the start of a massive psychological shift in modern history. Nazi ideology was about to be dismantled, not by bullets, but by the undeniable display of American industry. The truth was simple. Allied victory would be decided not just by battles, but by production numbers that Germany could never match. That collapse had already begun weeks earlier. On May 13, 1943, in Tunisia, General Jürgen von Arnim, who had replaced Rommel, surrendered with nearly 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops. The total kept rising as scattered units gave up over the following days. Among them were the Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, soldiers who had once pushed the British back to Egypt, men who had earned the reluctant respect of General Montgomery himself. But now, those same soldiers were prisoners. Among the captured soldiers was Headman Friedrich Radke. He held the Iron Cross First Class, had fought in the campaign in France, and survived being wounded twice during the North African battles. Years later, his diary was uncovered in the National Archives. Inside were detailed notes that gave historians a clear picture of the mental and emotional impact American captivity had on German troops. For Radke, the path from defeat to realization began at the port of Oran, Algeria. There, he and 30,000 other prisoners of war waited in temporary camps for transport ships. Even at this early stage, the efficiency of the Americans was starting to shake the beliefs these men carried with them. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners each day with a level of organization that outmatched even the Wehrmacht at the peak of its power. Each soldier had an identity card created, with photographs taken and filed. Medical checkups were completed, vaccinations were given, and their rights under the Geneva Convention were explained clearly, in fluent German, by American officers who had been trained specifically for that purpose. But the real surprise came when it was time to eat. Oberrichter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote to his mother, 8 months after the experience, "While we waited in the cages at Oran for transport ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert fighting. White bread, real coffee, and meat twice a day." At first we thought this was propaganda, that they were only trying to impress us. What we didn't realize was that this was their normal army ration. Then came the ships that would take them across the Atlantic. The Liberty vessels themselves were proof of America's massive industrial strength. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. Had the Germans known this fact at the time, they would have dismissed it as nothing more than a propaganda claim. Yet it was completely real. These ships, produced at a peak rate of 3 per day, were constantly crossing the Atlantic. After unloading supplies for the European front, they didn't return empty. By the summer of 1943, they were bringing back as many as 30,000 POWs each month. The 2-week Atlantic voyage in July 1943 became the second stage of psychological breakdown for many German soldiers. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept detailed notes in letters later sent to his family after his repatriation. He wrote that the ship's crew threw away more food waste in a single day than his entire company had received in rations during the last weeks in North Africa. According to Zimmermann, American sailors discarded half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, and gallons of milk that had been left out too long. They did it casually, not as a form of mockery, but simply because it didn't matter to them. The supplies seemed endless. The Liberty ships themselves became moving lessons in American industrial power. The prisoners soon learned that the vessel carrying them was only one of 2010 Liberty ships built during the war. Each ship required 250,000 individual parts, with components manufactured across 32 states. The engines, as some talkative American guards explained, came from 3 different factories. Each plant produced 900 horsepower cylinders, which were later assembled at ports that had barely existed just 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, from an old Prussian military family whose ancestors had fought in every war since Frederick the Great, later recalled what he witnessed. In his memoirs, he described the moment their ship neared the American coast. Above the bridge, a radar antenna rotated steadily. This was a technology they had believed was rare, something possessed only by Germany and perhaps the British in small numbers. Yet here it was, standard equipment on a simple cargo ship. It was then, he wrote, that I first began to suspect Germany had already lost the war. August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of America erased whatever remained of Nazi claims about American weakness. Norfolk Naval Base stretched across 4,300 acres, with docks running for miles and cranes unloading and reloading dozens of ships at the same time. In just one day, this single port moved more cargo than the entire German port of Hamburg managed, in a full week. Gerhard Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before being drafted into the army, counted 47 cargo ships in different stages of loading and unloading. In his hidden diary, he noted that each crane lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses back in Germany. These machines worked on electricity, smoothly, endlessly, without the coal smoke that darkened German industrial cities. The prisoners were then assembled into columns and marched toward the waiting trains. Along the way, they passed parking, lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them owned by dock workers. In Germany, private cars were mostly limited to the wealthy or the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to ordinary Germans since 1934, was still little more than a propaganda slogan. Fewer than 1,000 had ever actually been delivered to civilians. Yet here, everyday laborers drove their own cars to work. But the greatest shock was still ahead. The trains that awaited them were nothing like the boxcars or the infamous 40-and-8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses, that had carried German soldiers across Europe. Instead, they boarded full passenger trains, Pullman cars with padded seats that could fold into sleeping berths, dining cars laid out with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with wide glass windows. Hedman Rodka later wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." The American guards themselves seemed almost uncomfortable with the luxury. One sergeant even apologized, saying the air conditioning in their car wasn't working properly. Air conditioning. In August of 1943, most of the prisoners believed such comfort could only exist on Hitler's personal train. Yet here it was, part of an ordinary passenger coach. The 3-day train ride from Norfolk to the prison camps in Texas and Oklahoma would do more to break Nazi ideology than any battlefield loss. As the train moved through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, staring at an America that, according to everything they had been taught, was impossible. Every small town glowed with light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany might have had a single dim street lamp, were lit with rows of shop windows, neon signs and houses shining brightly with multiple rooms illuminated at once. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows blazing while parking lots remained full even at midnight. Obergefreiter Meyer, whose father had been a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, described what he saw in a letter uncovered in 1987. We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Every one of them had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had been electrified since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He only shrugged and said we would see. In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers completed the job in just 30 minutes, something that would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, and mechanized lubrication systems handled the work with ease. Even more unsettling for the prisoners was the sight of the workers themselves. These ordinary laborers wore leather boots so fine they would have cost a German worker 2 months of wages. They drank Coca-Cola straight from glass bottles, tossing the empties into bins without a second thought. They smoked cigarettes constantly, often putting them out half-finished. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer with Siemens before the war, tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He calculated that a single rail yard where their train stopped was using more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin consumed in a full day. The waste was astonishing, he later wrote. They left lights on in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in rooms where no one sat. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the scale of American industrial strength came fully into view. Through the windows, prisoners saw sprawling factories, each one larger than anything most had ever encountered in Germany. In Tennessee, the Alcoa aluminum plant stretched for 3 miles along the river. Its electric furnaces consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich used at the time. Near Louisville, the train slowed as it passed the rubber town complex. On land that had been empty just 18 months earlier, 4 massive synthetic rubber plants had risen. Each facility employed thousands of workers. Together, they produced 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber every year. By comparison, Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, recognized the significance immediately. In a post-war interview, he explained, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each one of these facilities was more advanced than anything we had built in Germany. And there weren't just 4 in Louisville. They told us there were dozens more spread across the country." The train rolled past Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, a complex so large it could be seen from miles away. Built in only 9 months, this single factory produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At its peak, 42,000 workers assembled these aircraft using 1,550,000 individual parts supplied by 1,500 subcontractors. The facility covered 5 million square feet of floor space and consumed more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Wehrle, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face to the train window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24 bombers in various stages of completion. "We had been told American planes were inferior, hurriedly built, unreliable, certain to fail in combat," he later wrote. "But I could see the precision of the assembly lines and the quality of their construction. These were not inferior machines. They were simply being built faster than we thought possible." The further the trains pushed into the United States, the more Nazi propaganda collapsed. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Below, barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. On both riverbanks, massive grain elevators stretched into the distance, each one able to store enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, the son of a Bavarian farmer, recorded his astonishment in his diary. "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, endless quantities with no concern for loss. I watched them load a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train halted near a sprawling stockyard. Tens of thousands of cattle stood waiting for slaughter, another overwhelming display of abundance. The smell from the meatpacking plants carried for miles. German POWs, who in Africa had often survived on just 200 grams of meat per week when they were lucky, now looked on as American workers casually ate beef sandwiches during their lunch break. Gefreiter Paul Fisher later wrote, "They ate meat the way we ate bread. No, that isn't right. They ate meat the way we wished we could eat bread." One of the guards even bought hamburgers for the prisoners from a food stand near the station. Fresh meat, cheese, and vegetables on white bread, for only 15 cents each. He bought 20 of them without a second thought, paying with a single dollar bill. To the Americans, this wasn't luxury. This was just everyday food. But what came next left an even deeper impression. Camp Hearn in Texas had been built in only 4 months. It could hold between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners, and the living standards were higher than what many of the men had experienced back home as civilians. The wooden barracks had electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. Each building was made with more lumber than entire German villages could boast. The camp hospital was perhaps the most shocking discovery for the German medical staff. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, suddenly found himself working in a facility that was better supplied than most hospitals in Germany. It had X-ray machines, modern surgical instruments, and a full stock of pharmaceutical supplies, items that had not been available in Germany since 1941. And all of this was considered standard care for enemy prisoners of war. They had penicillin. Dr. Bauer would later testify about this miracle drug, which most Germans had only heard whispers about. In the camps, it was used freely, even for prisoners with minor infections. At the same time that German soldiers were dying for lack of basic sulfa drugs, the Americans were giving their most advanced medicine to enemy prisoners without hesitation. The camp kitchen became another lesson in American abundance. Prisoners assigned to cooking duty discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of preparing meals for 5,000 men. The daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, amounts that German civilians had not seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, just excess. The regulations here require us to prepare 10% more than needed so that every prisoner gets a full ration. Whatever is left is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." By September 1943, a shortage of agricultural workers in the United States led to German POWs being employed in farms and factories across the country. What began as necessity soon became another powerful blow to Nazi ideology. Every day, groups of prisoners were taken by truck to different work sites. There were no blindfolds, no attempts to hide what they saw. They traveled openly through the American heartland, witnessing the vast fields of corn and wheat, factories running 3 shifts, shops filled with goods, parking lots crowded with cars, and houses equipped with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unterarzt Herbert Lang watched in amazement as a single machine processed more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could handle in a full month using traditional methods. The cotton gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that by 1943 had already delivered power to 90% of Texas farms. The farmer who owned the gin was, as Lange noted, just an ordinary man, not wealthy, not politically connected. Yet he enjoyed electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and even a tractor. His workers, including African Americans, opened lunch, boxes filled with more food than a German laborer could expect in an entire week. And this was considered completely normal. Every farm they passed told the same story. In Nebraska, prisoners were sent to work in sugar beet fields where they witnessed mechanized farming on a scale they had never imagined. A single combine harvester, they learned, could replace the work of 100 men. The fields themselves stretched all the way to the horizon, each one larger than many German counties. Farmers spoke casually of crop yields that would have seemed impossible back home. 60 bushels of wheat per acre, compared to Germany's best fields producing only 30. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote, The farmer's son, just 16 years old, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father earned in his lifetime. When Hoffman pointed this out, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a very good tractor. His father was already waiting for delivery of a new John Deere model that would be even better. But the most crushing realizations came to those who worked near or inside American factories. Under Geneva Convention rules, POWs could not take part directly in war production, but they were allowed to work in industries that freed American civilians for military-related jobs. This loophole exposed thousands of German prisoners to America's massive industrial power. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, they watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German facilities managed in an entire month. The factory itself ran with only a small workforce of women and elderly men, since most younger workers were away serving in the military, yet output still exceeded peacetime levels in Germany. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, wrote about what he saw. Everything in the American facility was automated. Conveyor belts ran on electricity, filling machines worked without pause, and massive steam cookers processed hundreds of cans at once. In Germany, this would have taken 50 workers, but here, a single elderly woman managed it all by simply monitoring the controls, while drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Near Detroit, prisoners assigned to unload coal at a power plant caught sight of America's automotive industry transformed for war production. Across the water stood the River Rouge complex, employing 100,000 workers and producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 5 million kWh of electricity each day, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Obergefreiter Franz Kellner recorded what stunned them most. The parking lots, thousands of cars, all owned by factory workers. In Germany, even many officers did not own cars, yet here ordinary laborers drove to work in their own vehicles. One American guard even remarked that many workers owned 2 cars, one for work and one for family use. The prisoners thought he was mocking them. By the winter of 1943, the steady impact of these experiences began producing what American intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome among the German prisoners. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's office, documented a sharp rise in requests from prisoners who wanted access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland, part of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943 on the growing number of German soldiers openly questioning Nazi propaganda and showing interest in American society. The prisoners no longer argued when confronted with American production figures. They had seen too much with their own eyes. Even the most committed Nazis had fallen silent. Many still held loyalty to Germany, but talk of victory disappeared. Instead, some openly questioned the propaganda they had once believed about America. This shift soon appeared in the camp newspapers written by the prisoners themselves. Der Ruf, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually moved away from defiant nationalism. Its pages began to discuss democracy, economic models, and ideas for rebuilding after the war. The editors, anti-Nazi prisoners carefully chosen by the Americans, found their readership increasingly open to these new conversations. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, described the transformation in a letter that passed American censors. We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military strength. But every day I am here I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals. Yet the most crushing blow to Nazi ideology came not from factories or food, but from the treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Those Italians who agreed to cooperate were placed into Italian service units. They received better housing, higher pay, and more freedom than ordinary POWs. German prisoners watched in disbelief as their former allies worked side by side with Americans, ate in restaurants, and in some cases even courted American women. Hauptmann Friedrich Schultz recorded his reaction. The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn wages, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system. Christmas of 1943 delivered one of the most powerful shocks to the German prisoners. Across the United States, churches, civic groups, and charities sent out 500,000 Christmas packages to men who, only months earlier, had been fighting to kill American soldiers. Each box contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and small games. Communities also extended invitations for POWs to join local Christmas dinners, though most could not attend due to regulations. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the Methodist Church Choir performed carols in German for the prisoners. Local women baked cakes and cookies, sending them into the camp, while the Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This display of kindness toward sworn enemies struck at the heart of Nazi racial ideology. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose own brother had been killed in the bombing of Hamburg, described the experience. "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies, yet they show us Christian charity. This is not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those who are absolutely certain of victory and confident in their strength." Then came the Christmas feast itself, a spread beyond imagination. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, fresh vegetables, pies, and even ice cream. These were quantities of food that Germans had not seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they could no longer continue, stunned that such abundance could be offered to them. Feldwebel Hansa summed it up simply. "We ate like kings, better than German generals, better than party leaders, and this was not even special." The guards explained that this was not a special meal. It was simply a normal American Christmas dinner, the same kind enjoyed in households across the country. If prisoners were fed like this, many wondered, what must American soldiers at the front be eating? By early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners had joined educational programs inside the camps. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and science. The University of Chicago offered correspondence courses, while Stanford University even sent professors to give lectures on democracy and economics. The hunger for learning was immense. Men who had once been told that Americans were uncultured, barbarians found libraries stocked with millions of books, universities that welcomed students from every class, and scientific research leading the world. They read American newspapers freely and compared opposing viewpoints, something completely forbidden under Nazi rule. Hermann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist drafted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They described science as belonging to all of humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and yet they shared this knowledge openly, even with their enemies. Such generosity of spirit was beyond the understanding of anyone raised under Nazi ideology." Camp life also offered theaters that screened American films, not propaganda but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, a story of defeat and recovery that struck a deep chord with them. They also saw The Grapes of Wrath and were stunned that Americans would allow such honest self-criticism to be shown, even to their enemies. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They openly display their problems, their disagreements, and even their failures. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would have meant execution. Here it is seen as patriotism." By the spring of 1944, prisoner labor programs had expanded as American industry reached its peak. German POWs were assigned to canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, where they witnessed the full scale of American production. The statistics alone told a story that no propaganda could erase. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would soon become landing craft for the D-Day invasion. They saw workers assemble 700 boats every month, each one made from more than 20,000 individual parts. The plant employed 20,000 workers, many of them women, who ran cranes, welded steel, and kept the assembly lines moving without pause. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann later wrote, Women doing men's jobs, African Americans operating advanced machinery, teenagers working drills. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. The factory ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In 1 month, they produced more boats than our entire Navy built in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners saw even greater numbers. The plant turned out 10,000 tons of steel every single day. Its massive blast furnaces ran nonstop, supplied by endless trains hauling iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale was beyond anything Germans could imagine. That one facility alone produced more steel than the entire Ruhr region at its highest capacity. I worked at Krupp before the war, wrote Oberwachtmeister Paul Hartmann. I believed I understood industrial production, but what I saw here was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could ever produce. Workers complained about overtime, even while producing amounts that we couldn't reach with forced labor and double shifts. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers." They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat belt, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners worked in orchards that stretched as far as the eye could see. They picked fruit by the ton, only to watch perfectly good produce discarded for small blemishes. In Germany, such fruit would have been priceless. Entire crops were even plowed under to stabilize market prices, a concept that was impossible for starving men to understand. Gefreiter Otto Schultz described it with disbelief. They destroyed food to keep prices stable. I saw mountains of oranges pushed into pits by bulldozers simply because they had too many. We begged to send them home to our families in Germany. The guards felt sorry for us but explained it could not be done. The waste itself was proof of something staggering. America's resources seemed limitless. On June 6, 1944, when news of the Normandy landings reached the prison camps, many German prisoners felt the final collapse of their beliefs. The sheer scale of the operation, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the very first wave, showed an organizational strength far beyond anything Nazi Germany had ever imagined. At Camp Shelby, prisoners watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless convoys of ships, the man-made harbors, and the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons of material every single day across open beaches. They realized their homeland was being overrun by the very nation they had been taught was too weak to fight. Oberfeldwebel Friedrich von Tauben later wrote, "We knew then that everything was finished, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the greatest industrial power in the world with fairy tales and racial myths. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, and courage against their limitless supplies. Yet, throughout their captivity, the prisoners discovered something even more damaging to Nazi ideology than material wealth: American humanity. Despite years of propaganda portraying Americans as weak and sentimental, the prisoners saw a people so secure in their strength that they could show mercy even to enemies. When Gefreiter Hans Müller received word that his son had died in the bombing of Hamburg, the American camp commander delivered the Red Cross message to him personally and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fischer's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children in Germany, American church groups sent food packages directly to her, even though Germany was still under bombing raids. Hauptmann Otto later explained it best. "They told us they were fighting Hitler, not the German people. At first we thought this was propaganda, but it turned out to be true. They were preparing us to help rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it." The medical care left a deep impression on many prisoners. German doctors worked side by side with American medical staff, gaining experience with modern techniques and advanced equipment. Prisoners were given surgeries that, in Germany, would have been available only to the wealthy elite. Mental health care, almost unheard of in the Wehrmacht, was also provided to soldiers suffering trauma. Dr. Friedrich Bauer later wrote, "They treated suicide attempts with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners suffering breakdowns were given therapy, not beatings. This compassion toward enemies revealed a strength we had never understood, the confidence of true power." By March 1945, the secret re-education program had achieved remarkable results. More than 25,000 prisoners had signed up for courses on democracy. Camp newspapers now printed articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Small discussion groups debated what Germany's future should look like after the war. The success went far beyond expectations. Men who had once arrived as loyal Nazis were now writing essays about building a democratic Germany. Officers who had sworn personal oaths to Hitler were planning how to bring American farming methods back to their homeland. Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, admitted in a 1975 interview, "We became missionaries for democracy, not because of coercion, not through propaganda, but because of what we witnessed. We saw it work. We saw ordinary Americans living better than the German aristocracy ever had. We wanted that same future for Germany." The change among us was so complete that American authorities began to worry the prisoners were becoming too enthusiastic about American life. Some even asked to remain in the United States after the war. Others married American women they had met through prison correspondence programs. By the 1950s, thousands of former prisoners would eventually immigrate to America and build new lives there. Then came April 1945, bringing the final and most devastating revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the prisoners were shown the footage. At first, many refused to believe it, insisting it was Allied propaganda. But the evidence was undeniable. Testimony from U.S. soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters arriving from Germany that confirmed the horrors. The psychological shock was immense. Men who had managed to preserve some sense of German honor, even after battlefield defeat, now faced the complete moral collapse of their nation. What they had fought for was not just defeated, it was evil. Hauptmann Walter Schmidt expressed it most clearly. "We believed we were warriors for a noble cause. Instead, we learned we were the tools of criminals. We thought we were bringing civilization to lesser peoples. Instead, we discovered we were the barbarians. The Americans, whom we called weak and decadent, showed us what civilization truly is." By May 1945, as the war ended, German POWs faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They had seen an America that shattered every belief instilled by Nazi propaganda. They had eaten better as prisoners than they ever did as soldiers. And, most striking of all, they had been treated with more dignity by their enemies than by their own government. The final months of captivity were focused on preparing German prisoners for their eventual return to a devastated homeland. American officials organized vocational training, modern farming lessons, and even political education. Prisoners were introduced to the ideas behind what would later become the Marshall Plan, learning that the United States intended not to punish Germany, but to help rebuild it. As Ost Friedrich von Tobin later wrote, "They prepared us to rebuild our country. They gave us practical skills, knowledge, and even hope. They turned defeated soldiers into future citizens." For men raised under Nazi thinking, such generosity from the victors was almost impossible to comprehend. Between 1945 and 1946, exactly 371,683 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They went back to a Germany that was divided, ruined, and impoverished. Yet they carried home something invaluable, the first-hand knowledge of how a democratic and industrial society could work. These former POWs who had experienced America's prosperity became unexpected messengers of change in post-war Germany. They had seen with their own eyes what industrial efficiency looked like, how productive agriculture could be, and what democratic stability offered to ordinary citizens. They knew recovery was not just a dream, because they had already lived inside a society that had achieved it. Many of these men later rose to prominence in the rebuilding of West Germany. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, went on to become West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who had taught classes at Camp Koch, became president of the European Commission, and Rüdiger von Marx, held at Camp Herne, would later serve as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackermann, once a prisoner at Fort Robinson, later became a major figure in reforming German agriculture. Men like him carried back with them what they had seen and learned in America. They introduced American techniques into German industry, applied American-style efficiency to farming, and carried democratic ideas into post-war politics. Much of the economic miracle of the 1950s was built on knowledge gained inside U.S. prison camps. Hans Kroll summed it up in his memoirs. We learned that real prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. We saw that democracy produced wealth, that diversity created strength, and that treating workers fairly boosted production. Those lessons, first absorbed as captives, became part of Germany's foundation after the war. Historians have often called the German POW experience in America one of the most effective re-education efforts in history. It was not achieved through forced indoctrination or empty slogans. Instead, it worked because the prisoners witnessed America in action. They saw factories running at full speed, yet workers were treated with respect. They experienced living standards that made Nazi promises look hollow. They recognized that American society thrived on freedom, not fear. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a leading historian of German POWs in America, put it plainly: America won the propaganda war not with clever words but with reality. Every hot meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners were convinced by prosperity itself. The numbers confirm this transformation. Out of the 371,683 German POWs held in the United States, fewer than 1% ever tried to escape. Only 2,222 escape attempts were recorded in total, remarkably low for so many prisoners, and a sign of how deeply life in America reshaped their views. Post-war surveys revealed that 95% of German prisoners rated their treatment in America as either good or excellent. Even more remarkable, thousands kept in touch with American families for decades after the war ended. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's conclusion, surviving German POWs held a reunion in Austin, Texas. More than 500 former prisoners returned, many bringing their children and grandchildren to see the very places where their transformation had first begun. One of them, former Oberreiter Hans Vea, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later built a career as a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the gathering. He recalled, "Life in the camps was far better than what many of us knew growing up in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and plenty of food, but more importantly, we discovered dignity." Former Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meyer, who had spent time working on farms in Iowa, added his perspective. "The farmers never treated us as enemies. To them, we were just young men far from home. They shared their meals, their farming skills, and sometimes even welcomed us into their homes. That kind of humanity, especially from families whose sons were fighting against us, changed us forever." At the reunion dinner in 1985, former Obers Hermann Gutz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that summed up their shared experience. He declared, "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as men who believed in lies. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had finally seen the truth. America showed us that real strength does not come from conquest but from production, not from hatred but from diversity, not from tyranny but from freedom. We saw the arsenal of democracy running at full speed. We saw farmers producing food for the world, workers building the machines of victory, and ordinary citizens treating even their enemies with dignity. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or its tanks, but its endless capacity for creation and its unshakable faith in itself. We went back to Germany carrying a mission to help build a society that created instead of destroyed, a nation that could achieve prosperity through peace rather than through war. The Germany that emerged from the ruins was shaped by the lessons we had learned inside American prison camps. We who once arrived as conquerors departed as students. To America, from your former enemies who became your friends, thank you for showing us the way. The words were met with a thunderous standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former foes now united, celebrated a transformation that had once seemed impossible when those first prisoner trains pulled into Texas back in June 1943. The scale and success of the German POW experience in America can be seen clearly in the numbers. More than 500 camps were built across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. Of these, 175 were main camps supported by 325 branch camps. Each facility was constructed to hold anywhere from 250 to 12,000 prisoners, with the average camp completed in just 90 days. A total of 371,683 German POWs were held in the United States, making up part of the 425,871 Axis prisoners overall. The peak number was reached in May 1945. Arrivals came steadily, about 20,000 new prisoners each month in 1943, 30,000 monthly after D-Day, and up to 60,000 per month in the final months of the war. Prisoners provided more than 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, processed 100 million board feet of lumber, and generated labor valued at $230 million in 1940s currency, while earning an average wage of just 80 cents per day. Their work helped fill critical labor shortages across 46 states. Most prisoners who attempted escape were captured within 24 hours, and not a single American civilian was harmed by an escaped POW. Education inside the camps was remarkable. More than 40,000 prisoners enrolled in organized courses. A total of 135 camp newspapers were published. Over 30,000 took English classes, 15,000 joined vocational training, and 8,000 participated in university-level correspondence programs. Post-war connections were equally significant. Around 5,000 former POWs eventually immigrated to the United States after the war. More than 12,000 kept up correspondence with American families they had met during captivity. On average, these exchanges lasted 31 years. Many returned later, as tourists, scholars, or even business partners. Treatment ratings speak volumes. Surveys showed that 95% of prisoners described their treatment as good or excellent. About 74% admitted their time in captivity had positively reshaped the way they saw the world. 61% said they developed an interest in democracy, and by 1945, fewer than 10% still held onto strong Nazi beliefs. The German POWs who witnessed America's industrial strength were not just spectators of history. They were changed by it. Their time in captivity became an education. Their military defeat turned into a form of enlightenment, and their imprisonment broke them free from the ideological chains of Nazism. In the end, America's greatest triumph wasn't only on the battlefield, it happened inside the prison camps, where the living proof of democratic prosperity achieved what no army alone could do: the complete transformation of enemy minds. These men had arrived convinced of German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. Out of more than 371,000 prisoners, only 2,222 tried to escape, a rate of just 0.6%. Not a single prisoner managed a permanent escape. American industrial power was not just overwhelming, it was beyond comprehension for men raised in a world of scarcity and dictatorship. The trains that carried them into captivity in 1943 had been filled with soldiers of the Third Reich. The ships that took them back to Germany in 1946 carried men who were ready to help build democracy. They had seen a different future, and they knew it worked. Their experience stands as proof of a powerful truth. America's greatest weapon was not its army or its weapons, but the undeniable evidence of what a free society could create in abundance. The German POWs were amazed by the strength of American industry, but in the end it was this very abundance that changed them. Out of their transformation came the seeds of Europe's recovery and the final collapse of the Nazi dream. They returned to Germany not simply as defeated prisoners, but as witnesses to what freedom could achieve. The West German economic miracle of the 1950s was built in part on what they had learned in American prison camps. Lessons that showed prosperity came from liberty, not conquest. From dignity, not racial ideology. From cooperation, not tyranny. When they first arrived, these men expected to find a weak and divided country ready to fall apart. Instead, they discovered an industrial giant with unmatched strength and surprising humanity. They had entered as prisoners of war but left as witnesses to democracy at its strongest moment. In their amazement at American abundance lay the beginnings of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic rebuilding of Germany. They had seen America with their own eyes, and it changed them forever. Their children would grow up in a free Germany, one that stood side by side with the United States. The partnership between America and Germany was born out of a remarkable transformation that started when 150 Afrika Korps veterans stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, and realized that everything they had been taught was false. The story of German POWs in America is, at its core, a story of redemption through discovery. It shows that the greatest victories are not always achieved by destroying an enemy, but by proving a better way to live. They were not convinced through propaganda, but through prosperity. They were not changed by hatred, but by humanity. The German soldiers who came face to face with America's industrial strength unknowingly became carriers of democratic values. When they returned to their homeland, they carried with them ideas that would help spark one of the most successful national rebuildings in history. Their journey from Nazi soldiers to future democratic citizens remains one of the most extraordinary transformations of the modern era. And what made this possible was not force, but the undeniable reality of what a free people could accomplish when working together. That was America's true secret weapon, not just the power to build more tanks and planes than any other country, but the power to turn enemies into allies through the simple strength of example. The German POWs were first shocked by America's industrial might. But more importantly, they were changed by what they saw. In that change, the groundwork was laid for a better world.